So we're going to start our final full session. I'm Ignatius, editor-in-chief of Harvard Business Review. Last year, at the end of the forum, we tried something spontaneous. We decided to challenge everything we thought we knew about what Richard would permit, what Vienna would allow, and we did something spontaneous, which was a sort of a talk show format dialogue with a few of the participants, kind of summing up their experience and their learnings at this forum. It was weird, it was somehow successful, and we made what might be the mistake of institutionalizing it and doing this again. So I'm going to be speaking with a series of people, with Lynn Forrester, de Rothschild, with, I want to make sure I get the order right, with Henry Mintzberg, with Jim Keane, and then with Andrew Hill, for 10, 15 minutes each, just kind of talk show style. I feel like as the talk show guy, I should tell a joke. My problem is I only know one joke. Your problem is that I'm going to tell it. And it's the old joke about the Russian economist who was asked, if you had one word to describe the Russian economy, what would it be? And he says, good. And then he was asked, well, if you had two words, what would that be? Not good. So in that spirit of brevity and maybe absurdity, we will start the conversation session of this program. So Lynn, why don't you come up now, and we, as she comes up, we're going to put on a short film about what she does.
Let's get real.
Heads of international business and guardians of the global economy, coming together at the apex of commerce and community to consider the ways in which we can build a better world.
Capitalism is the most energetic force on the planet, but it is not too big to fail. Today, capitalism is failing the unemployed, it's failing the underemployed, it's failing the never employed. Capitalism is failing the planet.
What worries me about just talking about inclusive capitalism is that our ambition is not sufficiently vaulting, sufficiently broad-ranging, sufficiently great.
That's where the industry really has to pick up. I mean, you can't legislate virtue. You can't, enforce this broader sense.
The challenge is to make capitalism more inclusive, to share it with everybody, so that we can recreate the miracles of the last 4 decades.
Okay, so Lynn Forrester de Rothschild is founder of the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism, in addition to being chief executive of E.O. Rothschild, the private investment company. So that was the ultimate teaser in the sense, okay, what is this?
Right, fair question. And I want to thank Richard and the forum for inviting me to be here today, and thank you, Adi. Well, what is inclusive capitalism? I think that Adam Smith would have thought it was a redundancy, and sadly today, too many people think it's an oxymoron. Recently, you might have seen that Bill Gates said capitalism is inept. And when you look around, and we've been touching on it a lot the last 2 days, and you look at the fact that CEO, as Henry mentioned earlier, CEO compensation today is 300 times the average worker. In 1980, when I started my career, it was 40 times. In 1965, it was 20 times. We have a situation where basically the term, the 1% would not have caught on if there weren't truth to it. And the idea of inclusive capitalism is not much different, and we're all part of the same effort. If it's conscious capitalism or sustainable capitalism or just capital, it It is about business and investors behaving better to create broad-based prosperity with increased trust and increased optimism about the future. That's what the goal is.
Yeah. So, which sounds fantastic. I mean, there are many, organizations like that, institutions like that. You mentioned some of them. I guess the question is, why create another one? It looked like there were a lot of kind of elite figures gathering together to solve the problems of the non-elite. So how would you measure success then with your group?
So it goes. Okay. So the way this got started was after Occupy Wall Street and the financial crisis. Dominic Barton, head of McKinsey, and I were asked to just head up a task force on where is capitalism going. And it was British and American, and it wasn't about government. And we looked into actually what is business doing that is good for society. Let's try to highlight the dog catches the car. Let's highlight the good stuff out there. And then I was asked by the City of London to co-host they called it an iconic meeting. What we think is that in order to make the system work better, there are lots of pressure points, right? There's the pressure point of investors, asset owners, the sovereign wealth funds, the asset managers, the CEOs that we've really been focusing on here. But a CEO can only do as much as her shareholders tell her to do. And then there's also the pressure of what customers can do. The Conference on Inclusive Capitalism is expressly designed to bring the largest asset owners and asset managers in the world together. And each year we've had about $30 trillion of assets under management, which is 1/3 of all assets under management institutional in the world. And if sociologists are right who say that if 20% of a group thinks there has to be change, there will be change. If that's true, if we could get this $35 trillion to invest for the long term, to invest with an incorporation of environmental, social, and governmental factors, what we call the tenets of inclusive capitalism, that would be the goal that we would try to reach.
And how do you drive? I mean, do you have the way the Clinton Global Initiative, for example, has members, participants make commitments? Do you have that? Do you sort of?
Well, I would love to do that. I haven't had the courage to require that. I might have an empty room.
Yeah. Well, if it was cash, but even pledges to.
Well, we're hoping to go there.
Yeah.
Last year, I was very grateful. I got an email right after the conference from the head of Schroders. They invest $500 billion. It's not, chicken feed. And they said that they had been thinking, but had decided as a result of the conference, to send letters to their investee companies that they would no longer have to provide quarterly guidance. So the idea is to inspire investors, and that's all of us. That's not only the big investors. If you're a member of a pension plan, you can engage and you can reach out and say, I don't care about profit only. I want you to look at other measures. I want to show you a slide, three short slides, if they could put them up. So this is one of your covers that talks about how Carl Icahn benefits, but the workers don't. And then you have in the article this amazing slide, ignore everything except for the top line and the bottom line. The years go across the x-axis. Up at the top is the increase in productivity. The blue line at the bottom is median income. So workers are being more productive, but they're not being compensated. How long do we really think that's going to continue? But a cover that I love that you did, or actually it was a story, and the FT picked it up about 2 weeks ago, and this is from the FT. Harvard Business Review does an annual list of the best CEOs. Jeff Bezos last year was #1 on financial only. This year, and maybe you can tell us why, Adi, you did it, you decided to incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors. That's what I call the tenets of inclusive capitalism. And on that basis, Jeff was 828 on a list of 1,000, bringing him down to 87 overall. Now, I believe Jeff is good enough that he's going to figure out that as a CEO, he has got to make his workplace better. He's got to take responsibility for his people and for his planet. But by doing this, this is something I see as all part of the movement toward inclusive capitalism.
So thank you for showing all those. This was not
you didn't
required.
Ask me to do it, no.
Although all the other speakers
and
all
I wasn't
oddly
sucking
have.
up to you.
No. But so let me loop this around to sort of the theme here then. So the problems you're trying to solve, the problems you're trying to address, even chip away at, to what extent is technology? Do you feel that technology, in whatever form, is part of the answer or is exacerbating the problem?
We've been talking about that a lot here. And I will tell you that the most difficult group to bring into this conference, and we have, the CEOs from the biggest, from Carlos Slim on, have been the CEOs out of Silicon Valley. And I think that there's going to have to be some leadership out of Silicon Valley. WhatsApp selling for $19 billion and employing 53 people. What does that say about how we're allocating capital and people? So there are huge questions. At the end of the day, regardless of everything that was said here today, I think that if there's going to be a war between humanity and technology, humanity is going to win. We're going to figure that out. We're not going to leave people behind in caves.
So before you go, I know you have a connection to Peter Drucker, although I don't really know what it is, but can you talk about that?
Oh, thank you. Professor Drucker to me. I went to Pomona College out in Claremont, and my senior year, I took a class that Professor Drucker opened up to undergraduates, and it was about a class this size, maybe even bigger. And all it was a lecture class once a week, and once a week there was a question, and on Friday and Monday we had to give the answer. There were no exams, just these things. And so I did it, and of course I was rapt attention, and I did it, and your dad, every week I got a check plus, and I thought, okay, that's fine. I slinked in the back, and at the end, I got an A+. And that pushed me into Phi Beta Kappa, and so I said, I was so excited. So I said, I've got to go meet him. So I went and I knocked on his door, and I said, Professor Drucker, I'm Lynn Forrester, you don't know me. He said, of course I know you. You're the best student in my class. And I was like, I was so touched. And then being me, I just said, I don't get it. How was I your best student? And he said, it's very simple. Every week you put your answer on one page. And no CEO in America reads more than one page.
That's fabulous.
And then he gave me my recommendation to Columbia Law School, to my first job and all of that. So I'm very indebted to Peter Drucker, and I think it is a fabulous thing that you hold this forum in his honor. I think he would be quite touched, don't you?
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks.
All right, so next up is Henry Mintzberg, who you've seen before, Cleghorn Professor of Management at McGill University.
That's me.
Welcome. Have a seat. So I was having a conversation this morning with Rick Wartzman of the Drucker Institute, and I was asking him, is Henry, is he an optimist or what? And Rick said, and I quote, Henry basically thinks management sucks, and it always has sucked.
Say that again. Henry thinks.
Sorry, the acoustics are bad, and
I got the Henry thinks.
management sucks.
Okay.
And that he's always thought management sucks. So, but let me ask you. So you've been sitting through these panels for a couple of days. What was missing? What did we not talk about that was important?
Yeah, let me also say something about that. I don't think management sucks at all. I think the current popular view of managing that's been promoted very heavily by shareholder value, bottom line, some of the things that Lynn was talking about, sucks. I think chief executives who practice management by deeming, which means they sort of pronounce performance figures that people should meet, and then if they don't meet them, they kind of kick them out. My granddaughter, who's 10 years old, could do that. I don't mean meet the targets, I mean set the targets. And so that's the kind of management that sucks. There's a lot of wonderful management. But what's missing in the conference? The conference has been wonderful, and the beauty of it, I think, has been its eclectic nature. And I think Peter Drucker would have loved that aspect. We just went from one thing to another. We hit almost every side of this issue, and it was quite beautiful. There were some sessions, like the first one this morning, that I think were fabulous. There were others I think were a little less fabulous, but overall very interesting. But Central Station in this city is inundated with refugees right now. The world is facing a huge problem with global warming. I'm all in favor of inclusive capitalism because I think we have to fix capitalism, but I don't think fixing capitalism will fix our problem. I think our problem is much bigger than that. One huge step is to fix capitalism. I think we're living in a world that's completely out of balance. I think it's out of balance because of the relationship between the sectors, the public sector, the private sector, and what I call the plural sector. And the plural sector meaning civil society, NGOs, everything that's not business or government. And a comment this morning about government is inept. And that's like a mantra, particularly in the United States. But why is government inept? And can we do without government? And should we just dismiss government as inept and let business take over, which is exactly what's been happening now? I mean, I could go on, it's all in the book, but when we said in 1989 that capitalism had triumphed when the Berlin Wall fell, balance triumphed. We had balance between the sectors before then, particularly in the United States, with tremendous welfare programs and high tax rates and so on. And we've been losing that balance ever since. And I think technology is a factor. I think individualism is a big factor because, we're citizens, we're members of community, and we're individuals. And that has to get balanced too. And that's public-private plural sector balance. And we're losing that. We've lost that, and the world is suffering. And as I said yesterday, I think technology drives a lot of that individualism because, all these technologies isolate us further and further from community activities.
Mm-hmm. So those are big problems. In terms of what we were talking about here, what we've been talking about for a couple of days, we're all sort of on a spectrum, I guess, and there are those of some of us who think technology is the answer. We can't even see it, but it will solve problems, somewhat magically perhaps, but as often can happen. Others who think, no, it's really chipping away at our humanity, the whole sort of premise of this meeting. Yeah. I guess if you assume the latter, and I think you do, and you talked about some of the problems that technology poses, what do we do about it? I mean, we're trying to be practical in this event. So I guess, from your session, maybe even redoubling some of the points you made or other things you heard. So what do we do about it? If there are aspects of technology that are making, the life that we're talking about, the work life, business life, office life, worse, what do we do about it? What are some takeaways?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with community relationships that the whole thesis of bowling alone, that, if you read de Tocqueville from 1830 about the United States, he talked about plural sector associations, community associations, as being critical to American life, but also critical to American democracy. We've seen a huge diminution of American democracy because of this opening of the doors to to private funding of election, private donations in elections, and so on. And that was key. The community sector was key to American democracy, and that's what we've got to renew. That's why I was emphasizing it. You know, I'm not. I wrote this kind of down a little bit. What you just said, Eddie, about the glories of technology and the dangers of technology. And I'm not a fan of the zealots or the Luddites. And I think there were a number of people here who didn't take either of those positions, but talked about some balanced, you know, and that's what we've got to do. We've got to balance our use of technology, but we've got to recognize, and many people said this over these 2 days, we've got to balance our human nature. You know, we've got to balance that, and we're losing that in all. I mean, if Volkswagen can pull off, and this is hardly more than the tip of the iceberg, it's the worst of it. But if Volkswagen can pull off a stunt like that, then what the heck is going on with the world? And when are we going to wake up? We had the G7 making an announcement that we will be getting rid of fossil fuels by 2100. How did any reporter report that with a straight face? In 85 years, we're going to get rid of fossil fuels? Are we kidding? And even the CBC, which is a government fairly liberal network, reported this as if it was serious. I mean, every country is going to go through 20 administrations, every one of which could cancel anything. They were making promises about tomorrow, but nothing for today. Please judge Paris not by anything they promise tomorrow, but what they're going to do today. Because, and this is what's going on in the world.
So in that spirit, so, you know, we're all here because we care about this issue. We care about issues. You know, we all want to make positive change happen. I would guess that we're all frustrated. You know, we go to places like Davos and people get together and nothing changes. You know, so how does change happen? So you have a crowd of people who are probably feeling fairly charged up after a couple of days, willing to be activists. You know, is it a matter of people individually connecting, you know, on these topics, connecting more, putting their cell phones away sometimes, or is meaningful change at a higher level? Is it about policy and, you know, the 20% threshold that demands change that can make it happen? What's your feeling? How does positive change happen? Do we know?
Well, it happens everywhere with everyone, and you never know who's going to do it. Gandhi happened to lead it in India, and I guess it hit the 20% mark with the salt marches or something, and sent it over the edge. In 1776, something happened in the United States. I'm going to say this country, in the United States, that put it over the edge, and people said enough. We've had enough of British colonialism. So something puts it over the edge, but. So I was speaking to somebody in the administration of the city. I did a session with some people here on Wednesday morning, and he was he had read my book and he was talking about the plural sector and so on. And because of his responsibilities, he went down to Central Station, and he was stunned by the spontaneous outpouring from the plural sector. All the plural sector means you and me acting outside of our business or public interests, not as citizens who vote, not as people who work in a company, but simply as members of society and members of community. A picture of Sikhs with something that said kind of Sikhs for, you know, Viennese Sikhs for help or something. I forget the exact words, but there's that spontaneous outpouring, and I see it from young people who are starved for some way to turn around what's going on now, and partly to correct what's going on in business, but partly also to recognize that the influence of business on other aspects of society is massive and rather destructive in many ways. The trade tribunals that no country should ever have accepted in all these pacts, and the fact that they got away with these trade tribunals is just abhorrent, and too much of this is going on.
Yeah. So on a happier
that
note,
doesn't answer your question.
No, I mean, so give us something that you see in the world that makes you feel a little bit more optimistic.
The energy of young people to do things. The fact that some people in Norway, in the Netherlands, took their government to court and got their courts rule against the government with regard to what it wasn't doing for global warming. It's another way around with the plural sector people acting through the courts. The United States had the famous Citizens United case where the Supreme Court threw the door wide open, the most horrible decision for democracy ever, threw the door wide open. Meanwhile, in Brazil, watch Brazil. I don't care about the corruption in Brazil right now. That corruption is criminal and can be prosecuted. The corruption in the United States is legal. The corruption in the United States is legal. Look at the Citizens United thing, which enables enormous amounts of money to come in. Compare that with what the Supreme Court in Brazil just did, which is to strike down political donations. The court, not the government. So I think, by the way, once Brazil, and I think Brazil will resolve its corruption problems, watch Brazil.
Yeah.
Brazil is like America 150 years ago. Full of energy, full of ideas, amazing civil society. That's where things are going to happen.
Yeah. Okay, Henry Mintzberg, thank you.
Okay.
So next up was going to be Gillian Tett of the FT because, I don't know, probably most of you know this, Lufthansa is on strike. She was on Lufthansa. They're routing everybody to different flights, so she had to dash off. So she will not be here. But next up is Jim Keane, who is the president and CEO of Steelcase, the big office furniture company that is kind of a workstation solution company. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Eddie. Right, so I'm Jim. I'm a public company CEO.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, I only have questions for Gillian. How does it feel working at the Financial Times?
Let me think.
I got to go.
Yeah, just keep going with this. There'll be one in there I can answer.
Okay. No, so when you were speaking earlier today, you had the 87% number up, and you suggested, but without giving a whole lot of detail, that there were technological approaches to getting more than the 13% engaged. And I was interested in what you were getting at, and maybe what you've tried at Steelcase that seems to be having that effect.
Yeah, so, I mean, all these things have to start with, if you ever start with trying to figure out how to use technology to solve a problem like that, you end up doing the mistake a lot of people make, and we make ourselves when it comes to product development, which is that you've got the solution all figured out, now you're just trying to figure out, how are you going to throw it at somebody? And we always start this by focusing on people instead. So it is a people problem. Engagement is a people problem, and it's mostly going to be a people solution. And so if you think about, for example, what gives people meaning at work, and it might be the fact that in large companies, as I said earlier, that it's difficult for employees to connect with their customers and connect even further with their users of a product, and this is true for us. I'll just give you one example of this. We sell to corporations, and then corporations have people who work in those corporations who use our products. So it's tempting for us to say, well, we have to focus on the buyer, the decision maker, and historically that's what a lot of people have done in the industry. Because users don't get a vote, mostly. The product just shows up at their desk. And we decided instead that we would really focus on users. And we believe that if we got it right for the users, we would eventually win more business because the users would speak to people within the company and say, this is the kind of stuff we need. So we tried to turn it around in that way. Now, how do you use people technologies and then other technologies? One of the things that we have done more and more is we host customers in our spaces, places where our people work. And it would be, again, tempting to just bring them into nice customer retreats or customer experience locations where we can give them good food and we can host a well-oiled experience. But instead, we just kind of walk around. So we'll walk all around our buildings, and we never really know what's going to happen because we never know what the customer is going to ask. And so we will, quite often I'll be walking and a customer will ask us a question, and we will just pull an employee up out of their chair. They might be just walking by, and we'll ask the employee that question. So there's a non-technical way, but I would still say it's a technology in a sense because it's how you engineer the customer experience can either be to protect customers and users from your employees or to actually do it the other way around and say, I actually want to do this in a way that even though I don't know what's going to happen, I would like to err on the side of giving employees a chance to feel that. And if you think about technology, we capture these moments too with customers using video, and we'll often have ways of through our town halls and through other meetings to show our employees the impact that they're having on people's lives. It's not about how much do we sell or did it help us meet quarterly earnings. It's what were these people trying to do? What state were they in before? How did the way we engage with them help them find a more meaningful way of organizing the way they work? I love some of the stories we heard here today. And then help everyone feel that, you know what, this is what we do. This is part of what we do, is we help everyone love how they work.
Mm-hmm. I know you're doing some experimentation with sort of the Internet of Things. And, if I understand it, it's, making office products, office furniture, whatever, smart and connected and presumably interacting with users and with each other. Can you talk about maybe some of the experiments that you've launched or
yes.
are hoping to
so
launch?
This is kind of humbling stuff after you follow Lynn and Henry. My world is about very simple things sometimes. So, for example, you've all struggled at some point with trying to get a meeting started, and how do you connect your laptop to the projector on the screen, on the ceiling that's aimed at a screen? And we have sociologists and anthropologists who would go out and they would wait for meetings to start to study the meeting. And the most interesting thing we found is that it takes like 5 or 10 minutes to start a lot of these meetings. You'd have people that would stand up on the conference table, a very expensive conference table, just trying to fiddle with the projector. And so we said, well, there must be a way to solve that. So without going into details, we developed some products that made it very easy for people to connect their devices to displays. And if you do it the same way every time, you get good at it. And if you find that same technology in every room you walk into, then you become an expert at it. And it reduces the stress and it accelerates the process of getting started. So now we keep going. Another experience, we love working on experiences that everybody hates, at work. So all of you have been, probably even the last few days, been on a conference call, a phone conference call. They're hideous experiences. You're connected, you can't hear well, you're at the airport, there's announcements, somebody is dropped off the call. There's actually a fascinating YouTube video on this topic. It's hilarious, except that I've lived through these conference calls myself, and it's not so hilarious when you've experienced it. And so, we engage in things like that. How can we help technologies simply let people do what they want to do, which is have a conversation without the technology getting in the way? Another example is video conferencing, which in its first incarnation was, again, hopeless. You had to go to a very special room that was designed like a TV studio. You were all arranged carefully in a rigid arc facing the cameras and the screens. This is a room you would never go to if you didn't have to use video conferencing, right? You would never go there. And here you are having some of the most important meetings in the world. And by the way, space and technology shape behavior. So we also learned when we watched this that if you had 8 people in a room, everyone would be talking to everyone over the course of the meeting. If you have 6 people in the room and 2 people on the screen, the people in the room interview the people on the screen as if it's some sort of a news show. And so all the social interaction changes just because it looks like we're here to interview them. And so that's exactly what we do. So if you can step back from that and say, how might we think about video conferencing the same way we think about other everyday technologies? And how could we actually make the technology work harder to come around us in a way that it's more human? Let's design the space so you have a human face-to-face interaction and let technology just be a layer that gets added on. So those are things that are fairly in the now. Things that are more in the far that we're exploring and you have to believe me here that I believe that the future is an engaged workforce, and that the role of corporations and people like me, managers, is not to look over people's shoulders and monitor behavior and use data to try to manipulate behavior in some way. You have to believe that, otherwise you don't want to see corporations do anything with technology. But if you do believe that, and you say, maybe the purpose of technology is not to give more information to me, but it actually helps all of us who work in space every day, you begin to wonder what the potential would be if the spaces were more aware. So if the space actually knew what your preferences were, it knew who you were, it knew how you like to work. And we've done some experiments around this in, again, very simple ways. So there's a room that we do a lot of experiments on ourselves. So there's a room I work in periodically, where when I go in, I can change not just the light intensity of the room, but I can change the color temperature. So I can have it go from cooler to warmer. And over time, I've discovered what I really like. So at first I thought, well, maybe this is what everybody likes. But everybody I brought in there, I asked them to vote. And people are all over the place. Some people like it cool, some people like it warm. What you really discover is we're all different. But what if the space knew each of our differences and each of our preferences, and you actually got to choose things like that, or the background sound in a space, or how private it was in terms of acoustic privacy or visual privacy. If you got to do things like that, if you were actually able to engage not just in the meeting, but everything about it, how you cast that room, and when you walk into the room, it's waiting for you. It's already been set up. Could that make a difference in the work experience? Could that mean that you go home at the end of the day feeling more energized than when you arrived? So those are some of the things we're thinking about for the future of workplaces and how technology might be put in.
To follow up on that, so let's say non-technological. We didn't talk a lot about, we were talking about humanity and the dignity of the worker. I didn't hear a lot of discussion about sort of workplace geography. And you're in it, you're thinking about it, you're thinking about the future. And when I was at Time Magazine, we all had perimeter offices with TVs. Then we expected that, and then they threw us out to the cube farms. Then we decided, that's good, and now it's sort of open. And
I'm sorry about all that.
Yeah, they were a lot of your products. But now we're sort of it's all open. We try to figure out individual space and collaborative space. Do you have strong thoughts about the geography that not only increases efficiency of the company, but kind of respects the dignity of the worker?
Yeah, I think there's, when you talk about geography, are you talking about
layout, sort of office?
Yeah. So, again, starting with human problems. The number one and number two complaints in offices around the world is individuals are too hot or too cold. And you know who you are out there. Some of you who are generally too hot, and some of you are generally too cold. And you could solve that in lots of different ways. But what's really interesting when you dig into that is they're often sitting right next to each other. So if you're the facility manager and you're trying to get that right, you go, well, what am I going to do? If I turn it up, then the two warm people are going to be even more uncomfortable. If I turn it down, then you get the idea, right? So the problem really isn't that the temperature is wrong. The problem is the idea that we're going to force people to sit next to each other because, I don't know, alphabetical order or job function or something meant that they had to sit next to each other, and all day long they're miserable. So why can't we break rules like that? So one part of the geography is, what if we all could choose how we wanted to work at any given point in time? Yes, you can go to some assigned space if it's been assigned to you. These days, a lot of companies are experimenting with not having assigned space. But what if you had freedom and you could actually get up and move? So what if you actually had information too, so that when you walked into the space, if you want the warmer area, you actually know where that is. There's an app for that tells you what's warm or what's cold. And you could find the space that's most comfortable. What if when you felt like you needed a time to concentrate, you could go to a place where you could have limitless privacy? Or when you wanted to re-energize by connecting to other people, you could get up and move and do something like that. So the problem with geography of the office is twofold today. One, we don't give people enough choices that are literally way too standardized in most offices. And again, true around the world. There isn't enough variety. So people go to the coffee shop or they go someplace else because they can't find it where they work. The second thing is there's not enough freedom. Company policies and company behaviors have led to this idea that I kind of have to sit where I was assigned, and I start my day here, I'm going to end my day there. And I think both of those could break. So imagine in a totally different world, you could have a workplace that has a much wider degree of variety and much more freedom for people to choose what's right for them in any given moment.
Mm-hmm. So last question before you go. You also mentioned in your earlier panel, you talked about leaders being curators of culture. And I'm interested what you mean by that, and at Steelcase, particularly during a time of transformation. Talk more about that.
There's one thing you learn when you, so I've been CEO for 2 years, and it's true for me, but it's true for really all the people who are leaders, that there's a lot of symbolism involved in what you do, and then there's a lot of reality to what you do. So I'll talk about one symbolic thing and then kind of a reality of how we work in an experiment we're doing. So when I go to a factory, there's data everywhere. And we have lots of factories. And when I walk in, at first the teams would present to me cost information. Here's what our performance metrics were, here's what our productivity metrics were, here's our goals for the coming quarter, and so on. Of course, those are all important metrics. But we changed the order so that whenever we do this presentation now, we start in a different part of the metrics. We start with safety. And what we found is that you never find a plant that has a good safety record that has bad cost performance. Like if they've got safety right, it turns out they get everything right. Because if you're running a plant that's safe, then you care about people. And if you care about people, they get it. And almost everything else takes care of itself. So that's one aspect of thinking about culture and the symbolism and things that you can do as leaders. Another one, though, and this is what I've been wrestling with lately. So in our company, we've been trying to, we have a very open culture. Yes, we have people like me and vice presidents. We have a floor, but it's kind of like off to the side. It's not at the top of the building. And it's a very open space. There isn't security. Anybody can kind of go through there. Over the last few years, we've been trying to push more decision-making down in the organization so that we do less deciding. And as we've done that, that space has gotten quieter and quieter because there's fewer meetings that take place there. So one of the things we're rethinking now is to say, well, what is our job anyway? What's the job of leaders in a company? If it's not deciding, then what should it be? And if it is about curating culture, as I mentioned before, then you can't do that in a space where you expect people to bring problems to you. You kind of have to be out there on your hands and knees in the organization, feeling the little subtle shifts, the subtle changes, the weak signals in the organization, noticing that two people who don't normally meet together are suddenly meeting together. And we've got interesting places to do that. So we have a university called our Learning Center. We're actually building a new one in Munich. We have an innovation center, and we put those two things together. And what we're going to do now is take the leaders in the company, and we're going to put our spaces right in the middle of that space. So it won't be a separate leadership community. It's really, we're on a hallway, so a hallway that connects these two areas where people pass every day. We'll position ourselves on kind of the banks of that river so that we feel that energy of the organization passing through. And if we need privacy, we can always withdraw and get privacy. But again, we're always experimenting, and we're hearing this from our clients. A lot of people are feeling like the idea of a leadership floor doesn't seem to make sense anymore if you think about leadership in this new context. Mm-hmm. So,
thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim Keane. All right, and last but not least is our chairman from the FT, Andrew Hill. Chairman Andrew.
Thank you, Adi. I just wanted to remark that it's nice that we're ending, having had a beginning where I think journalists were clearly identified as a tribe that was going to be swept away by technology. We're finishing with 10 minutes of two journalists talking to each other.
Yes, I'll start.
And I, for one, am never going to leave the stage on the basis of what we've heard.
So should we just say goodbye?
Yeah.
Goodbye, everybody. So Andrew's great fear was that I was going to ask him to say what was the big takeaway from the conference. And I forget what I said to you, but anyway, my first question is, what was your big takeaway from the conference?
Well, I guess some of the things that Henry and others have talked about in this session, including I don't think anyone quite picked up the gauntlet I threw down this morning on, can we think of ways in which organizations can find a way to mitigate the inevitable disruptive impact of technological change? Because, as everyone has said, governments are either not competent or not prepared to do it. I think there are small exceptions to that case. And so organizations, even as they are disintegrating or being disrupted, are going to have to find ways of doing this. And I think the danger is, although I quite like the idea of being a curator of culture, I think the danger is that curators don't necessarily have the powers that will allow them to protect the things that they are curating in the way that chief executives have, in theory, had in the past.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned today I thought was very interesting, and I don't know if you were just winging it or if this was a product of a lot of deep thought on your part, but that human interaction could be, the luxury service in the future, the luxury of the future. What do you mean by that?
Well, I was winging it, so
Okay.
I'll continue to wing it.
Okay.
I guess what occurred to me during the discussion that we were having this morning with Sherry Turkle and others was that we are clearly in a situation where I think individuals will, some voluntarily, some involuntarily, will be more like networks of freelancers, and already are in lots of cases. And whenever I've met anybody in our profession who's freelance, they are working non-stop. They are working their contacts in order to get stories. They are pitching stories to other people. They are making sure that they are able to suck up new ideas, but also they can't stop churning out the pieces that they need to write. It's hard work, which is why I've stayed under the comfortable umbrella of the FT for so long, probably. But and so in a world in which there are more people pursuing those kinds of networked jobs, it seems to me they are going to have to remain linked to their technology. And of course, it's an enormous enabler of that type of work and of the type of work that we do. Clearly, we can work across lots of different areas now, when previously we might have said we're going to shut everything down to go to a conference and then file on our way on, when we return to the static computer, we're now able to do things on the move. But some of those people are not going to be able to have the very clear space that lots of people have said is needed in order to reflect, in order to have the ideas, in order to be able to remain creative. And so that might become the preserve of a chosen few. I also think, and this was the winging it part, that it's evident that when people return from the latest digital or technological version and decide they actually liked having a bit of vinyl or a book, or they wanted a bespoke item that has since been superseded by what you can get on your iPad, when they return to buy it, it's always more expensive. And there are already places that are offering for a pretty hefty fee peace and quiet. We wrote about a hotel, I was just looking it up, in Baden-Baden. It's the Villa Stephanie, if anyone wants to join me there later, at €1,000 a night, with a silver switch that you hit in order to cut off all internet access in your room. So this is a luxury item now.
So one thing I heard a lot was people talking about their inability to switch off, to get from out of the mountain of emails, from not being tempted to pick up their iPhones first thing in the morning or look at it last thing at night, and then at some point to blame it all on millennials. Where do you come down? I mean, were there things that changed your mind in this discussion? What you thought about technology that, as you heard the discussion, maybe you shifted a little bit?
Well, I guess I started thinking that we would all be far too pessimistic. And I know there are people, I've seen the tweets and talked to some people who think we have collectively been quite pessimistic about what John Hagel called the kind of amplifying effect, that the amplifying effect of technology will be bad rather than good. So I was quite pleased that actually what did come through was the idea that you could amplify the positive with technology, and that it wouldn't necessarily be the negative. I don't think that changed my mind. I think I'm in two camps. I was roundly mocked by my colleague Lucy Kellaway in a column, although thankfully she didn't name me, for being one of those people who wears a wristband that monitors my steps. And I find it actually has changed my habits. I do choose to walk. So there are positive things happening with little elements of technology that other people think are ludicrous and ridiculous.
By the way, I suspect everyone in this room has been mocked at one time or another by Lucy Kellaway.
Yeah, that's true. It's not an exception. It's just I sit next to her, so I'm an easier target.
Yeah. So I thought that some of the discussions about presumed millennial habits. I just gave a talk on millennials, so they're very big in my mind. I also have 3 millennial children, but some of the talks about the sort of presumed habits and some frustration with these presumed habits. And then I don't know if you saw the session where the people who wrote the Drucker essays came on, and many, if not all, were millennials, and they didn't really seem to fit any of the stereotypes at all. They actually seemed to have technology quite in balance in ways that we, in my case, the baby boomers, are having trouble sort of, trying to manage the technology. So it may not be as generational as it is individual, or in some cases, expectations of companies that need to do things like, say, after hours, the email system doesn't work.
Right.
And we're not going to ask you to disconnect, we're actually going to disconnect, and some do that.
I mean, my experience of Drucker Forum this time and in the past has been, and this is why I'm quite reluctant about saying anything about any generation, to be quite honest, is that to try and say that a younger generation, whatever you might want to call it, behaves in a particular way is bound to annoy almost all of them, because there's always going to be some element of difference. Thank goodness. I mean, that is one of the kind of virtues. And that session, which as I said when I recommended it before we went off for lunch this morning, that session again showed that you could defy expectations, if there is an expectation, very easily just by bringing up any group. This obviously a particularly bright and promising group of people from a single generation, and trying to pigeonhole them, you will be very quickly disappointed and surprised.
Yeah. So as somebody who covers management as you do, are there things, whether you've written about them or not, things, companies, individuals who are doing sort of amazing things that you think are inspiring and that it's worth telling the world about?
Well, I mean, you've all seen the boss of Hire, Zhang Min, who I had an interview with for an FT piece just before this session. I mean, that is a very interesting experiment that's going on there, and I think it'll be just fascinating to see how that turns out. More interesting, actually, than the one that gets all the headlines, which is the Zappos holacracy experiment in flat hierarchy or managerless managing. So that I find extremely interesting to keep an eye on. I'm interested in what's going on with the micro companies that are springing up. I haven't studied them, but as an interesting, I think, back to the point about networked workers, I think there's a very interesting point in the motivation of micro enterprises, one-person enterprises doing the kind of Amazon Turk type work that is now being farmed out even by quite big companies. We tend to think of that as kind of drudge work, but clearly if you are a single entrepreneurial person doing that type of work, and you're given the account for PwC or GE to run their back office or part of their back office, that's an enormous feather in your cap and must have an enormous motivational effect. So possibly we are going to get an increased sense of motivation from having a network of individual micro-enterprises that run those types of businesses and back office for big companies than we have had from departments of employees in the past. I think that's an interesting area. How to study it is a different matter.
Yeah. So before we end, and we're about to end, what's your big takeaway from this discussion we've been having for the last couple seconds?
I think the big takeaway is that journalists are here to stay, and there's really no...
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrew.